Our next speaker has a passion for figuring out how to do more with less and using that mindset to enable customers in their security journey. I have to say that this is one of my favorite titles, point of personal privilege. My youngest daughter just lost her first two teeth. As a parent, your child losing their teeth right before Christmas is the greatest thing ever. And our next speaker's title had me rolling, and I wanted my daughter to come introduce because he is a Senior Security Specialist Solutions Architect for Amazon Web Services in the Worldwide Public Sector Group. Before that, he was a Chief Information Security Officer in local government for a decade. Please join me in welcoming Anthony Harvey.
All right, good afternoon. Like you said, I'm Anthony Harvey. I'm a mouthful of a title. I'm a Senior Security Specialist Solutions Architect with AWS, but I wanted to talk a little bit about generative AI today and about some of the security aspects of it, because I talk with customers all the time about generative AI, and they ask similar questions around generative AI security. And so I wanted to talk about the 4 big ones that come up, especially when we think about it from a public sector standpoint. And so with the first question, right, when we think about your generative AI security, a lot of people ask, what do I actually need to protect? And maybe when we think about it from a category perspective, I want to break it down into like 3 different categories. You have your infrastructure. And I had a conversation about this actually out in the hallway earlier, because a lot of people forget about your security basics, your things like your identity and access management, right? Being able to look at your detection and response, being able to monitor what's going on, and having your standard application security. That does not go away with your generative AI applications. But also thinking about how can you protect your data, right? So when we think about data classification, I was working with a couple of different hospitals over the course of the past couple of weeks, and they are leveraging generative AI in a healthcare setting. Now, because they're training their data on potentially sensitive information, that generative AI application is now actually inheriting that same data classification. So I think you all probably have obviously some sort of data classification in your organizations today. That still carries over to your generative AI applications as well. The other portion from a protecting your data standpoint is that you also want to know how your data is being used, right? When we think about it from a privacy perspective, there's a lot of applications and a lot of generative AI use cases out there where they're going to take your data and continue to train it back into the model, right? And we've seen scenarios where that model and then eventually ends up leaking that data out to someone who it's not intended to receive or be used for. So really kind of understanding how that aspect comes into play. And then lastly, of course, protecting your generative AI applications themselves, right? So when we think about putting in your inputs, you want to make sure that you're actually maybe stopping people from sending social security numbers directly into the model itself, right? That you're blocking people from trying to trick the model, right? I see this a lot in higher education as well, where you may have some students that are bored during class and they want to go through and try to trick a model and try to make it do something that it's not supposed to do. Being able to protect those inputs, but also those outputs as well. So if you have a model that is in a, let's say a local government setting, maybe it's something related to taxes and there potentially has access to social security numbers, that should not be outputted back out to the general public, right? So being able to protect both the input and the output side of the house. Now, with the second question, it really kind of comes down to compliance and how you can actually address some of those compliance concerns. And I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to try to pretend to be one. Definitely engage with your legal advisors, engage with your legal counsel. Things change all the time. You all saw Governor Newsom's legislation and everything that kind of came out earlier this year. We're tracking a little over 900 different pieces of legislation and initiatives across the world as it involves generative AI. So when we think about how are you really trying to keep up with this, know that it's really kind of an evolving field still, right? Different jurisdictions are going to have different requirements. If you're working through maybe in a multi-state partnership or anything like that, right, you're going to still have different requirements when it comes to generative AI use cases. And also making sure that you understand the risks inherent to AI, right? Like, for example, the fact that it's not deterministic. And what I mean by that is that you're not going to always get the same output, right? This is the benefit of generative AI, is that it creates new content, it creates new ideas, but also knowing that from a compliance standpoint, that makes it a little bit trickier to navigate, and you have to understand when is the right time to actually use it and do so. Now, with the third one, right, people are asking about how do I make sure that the models perform as intended? And I think this is probably one of the biggest ones for the public sector, because this actually kind of stems into the concept of responsible AI. And what I mean by that is making sure that you're using AI in a way that reduces risk to the general population. So in the first case, right, we have toxicity, where we're thinking like, how does this actually impact our population? So if you have a model that can potentially give you offensive content, right, that may potentially do something that isn't representative of your population. We heard it earlier, we have almost 200 different languages and dialects across the state, right? So how do you make sure that you have a model that is representative of your population? How do you make sure that you have a model that reduces bias in its output? And you can do so with like guardrails, for example, being able to have another system looking at some of those inputs and outputs and seeing whether there's any sort of bias, right? Whether it's actually fair to the end user. And then from a privacy standpoint, right, there's a couple of things that I want to call out here. When you're training a model, right, and when we talk about model, in a loose sense, I'm going to say generative AI application, there's really no way to untrain it, right? So when you go through and like, oh, I have this generative AI application, I want to train it on my internal documentation, right? There's no way to unlearn that data. It essentially stays with it. And from that standpoint, from a data privacy standpoint, you want to make sure that you're handling that model with care, that you're deleting it when you no longer need it. Retention laws are probably still going to apply to your generative AI models. Your FOIA requests are probably still going to apply to your generative AI models. So think about that from a privacy perspective. And then lastly, from an auditability and explainability standpoint, what we're trying to do here is understand how you went from point A to point B, right? So if you have a model and it gives an output, let's say it's a chatbot for real estate taxes, for example, how did that model arrive to that conclusion and give it to that resident, right? Did it go through and look at a knowledge base? Did it pull it from a wiki? Did it pull it from a database? Did it do any sort of manipulation with the data before it gave it back to the resident, right? So that's what we really kind of mean by that explainability. And then from an auditability standpoint is how do you manage the life cycle of that generative AI application? So like when you go through and you bring in that training data, where is it coming from? Have you checked it for bias? Have you checked for any sort of data tampering, any sort of training poisoning? Are you monitoring some of those inputs and those outputs? Because especially with these models, they're going to be changing over time. They're going to be continuously improving. So you need to make sure that you're continuously monitoring and continuously iterating on how you protect that information. And then lastly, I guess maybe kind of the elephant in the room, where should you start, right? How do you actually get started from a security perspective? Now I'm going to say there's no universal set of actions because every use case is going to be different. If you're doing this in a healthcare use case, that's going to be completely different than a criminal justice use case, completely different than a higher education use case. But definitely start with something that has privacy in mind, like, of course, Amazon Bedrock. But one thing I really want to call out here, if you have a chance to take a look at this QR code, it links to what we call our security scoping matrix. So whether you're a builder or a buyer of generative AI applications, we actually go through and we talk about these different categories, right? We have 2 categories for buy, 3 categories for build. And so if you're going through and looking at a new generative AI application, take a look at this matrix. We're going to walk you through what you need to know from a governance, risk, and compliance standpoint, from a legal and privacy standpoint, from a resiliency standpoint, right? And we're going to do that across those 5 categories. So when you go back to your organizations and you're looking either at a new one or maybe just reevaluating an existing one, leverage that scoping matrix and figure out, hey, am I doing my backups right? Am I thinking about bias in my data? Am I protecting against some of these large threats that we see against generative AI applications? So definitely want to give that as kind of like a takeaway and something that I challenge you all to go and try to implement in your environment, or at least review with your existing generative AI applications. And so, with all that being said, these are kind of the 4 big ones that customers ask me. I'm going to be at the AWS booth, so if you do have any more questions about generative AI security, this is at a super high level. We can definitely get much, much deeper into how we can help protect against some of these threats, especially in a public sector use case. But I wanted to say thank you so much for listening about some of these generative AI questions, and I'll be around if anyone wants any follow-ups.